Hello and welcome again to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Wipf Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Wipf and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So we're now on our second episode back this fall, and this time I'm pleased to welcome J.D. Lyonhart onto the show to discuss his book Monotheism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. J.D. is a British-Canadian theologian, a philosopher, an author, an ordained minister, as well as an advocate for the learning disabled and neurodiverse. He is an associate professor of Christianity and philosophy at the University of Jamestown, a fellow at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism at Cambridge University, and a co-host of the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. And now, I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. So today I am joined by Jonathan Lyonhart, who writes under the name J.D. Lyonhart. So for our listeners, if you're looking for his books or trying to find him online, you'll probably have more success looking for J.D. Lyonhart. But for the purposes of our interview today, I'll be calling him Jonathan. He's the author of a number of books, but today we're going to be talking about his book Monotheism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub, which is maybe the best book subtitle I've ever come across. The funniest one for sure. So Jonathan, I know you've been on the podcast before, but for maybe folks who have not listened to that episode, and I know also you have some recent developments in your professional life as well. So could you maybe just say a bit about yourself for our listeners, what you do, and what you research?
Yeah, for sure. I am a professor of Christianity and philosophy at the University of Jamestown. I'm also a fellow at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism. I do a lot with Platonism and Christianity, philosophy and Christianity. And I'm also the co-host of the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, which is basically an excuse to interview whoever I feel like interviewing that week. A few weeks ago, we had a Satanist on. That was a blast. We had Rupert Sheldrake on, talked about telepathy and science. It's the craziest subjects ever, but the dude's got a PhD from Cambridge, super legit, had him on. We've had Andrew Davison from Cambridge talk about UFOs and theology.
Nice.
It's just a blast. So I'm kind of interested in any intersection or overlap between theology, philosophy, science, and whatever crazy stuff is interesting. So I consider myself an interdisciplinary philosopher theologian, such that I don't really specialize in just one area. I kind of eclectically chase whatever thing I'm interested in for maybe 6 months and then move on to the next thing. So yeah, that's
Very cool.
kind of what I am and what I do. And yeah, I was on the podcast before for my book Space God, Rejudging a Debate Between Einstein. And now I'm here, I guess, talking about monotheism, which is the book I actually is kind of my passion project book. The other one was just my dissertation. This is the one that I just had a blast doing. And I'm really glad this interview is audio, not video, because I'm in my office basically laying down. And I'm so relaxed. I've got a cup of orange juice and a brownie, and it's like getting all over my beard, and you can't see it, so I don't care. So
we're reclining at table, just like Jesus and his apostles. So it's the best way to have a conversation, I'm pretty sure.
That was the best possible spin you could put on that. I appreciate you doing
that. Speaking of your dissertation, I know, I feel like if I'm remembering correctly, you studied at one of the Oxbridge schools for your PhD. Is that right?
Yeah, I did it at Cambridge under Douglas Headley.
Okay,
and
nice.
the Cambridge Platonist group there.
Very cool. Very cool. Douglas Headley does kind of Christian Platonism stuff, doesn't he?
Yeah. He's that overlap between theology, philosophy, that's so potent in the Cambridge Platonists, who are trying to be both Christian and Platonic at the same time. So,
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. Well, I'm going to ask you the same opener question, even though we did it last time, because I think in light of our conversation, I don't know, your answers might be different. And also, I just want to, yeah, I want to hear what you have to say. So, if our opener question is, if you could place any three figures, dead or alive, in a room, and you could listen in on their conversation, which three figures would you choose to place in that room, and why?
oh, I think I don't remember what last time, so it'll probably be different this time.
That's good.
Um,
That's good. I was hoping for a different answer anyway.
what's
So,
different? I have no idea. I'm just gonna look around my room and see what I see here. I don't know. Plato,
okay.
Nietzsche, and part of me that wants to put Jesus in there, but I want to have a third person who's less academic to just kind of like bring in the real world concerns a bit. I mean,
Mhm.
I guess Jesus could do that, but um, maybe Winston Churchill just throwing
Oh,
out some
nice.
witticisms and occasionally like, what are you talking about? Like kind of dragging it back down to reality. So yeah,
Nice. I like that room. So Plato, Nietzsche, and Winston Churchill.
yeah.
That would
Churchill
be,
not
yeah.
so much for what he could like content wise contribute, but more how he would alter the other two
Yeah,
and
yeah.
change the nature of the conversation.
Yeah, the way his whole persona would change the conversation would be really interesting for sure. Okay, let's talk about your book Monotheism. So could you tell me just a little bit about your book, what it's about, what kinds of arguments or conversations you're trying to put forward in it?
So the book is a conversation between three people in a pub. Hence the subtitle, "An absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub." And I guess I should have said that my three people I'd want to put in a room would be the three people that I put in the room for the book. So I lost. That was a missed opportunity. Um, Basically, the book looks at the Trinity in comparison with the origins of the universe. And the argument of the book is that, when you look at the Trinity, the Christian Trinity, this idea that God is Father, Son, and Spirit, God is somehow this eternal, transcendent, timeless Father figure in the clouds, and yet he's also simultaneously one with this incarnate, temporal Christ who can get crucified down here on earth. And also the Spirit is thrown in there somewhat for just kicks, and most people have no idea why the Spirit's there or what the Spirit does. And yet, all three people are said to be one God. It's not three gods, it's one God. And these aren't parts of God, like different faces of God from different angles. No, they're all fully God. Uh, and this is just sort of an enigma. And I remember when I was first wrestling with it as a Christian, and I just could never make sense of it. It did not make sense to me. And so there was part of me that was just like, well, if it doesn't make sense, I won't believe in it. But then later, I began studying cosmology and the origins of the universe, and that relates a bit more to the other book, Space God. And what I found when I was looking at cosmology and how the question of how the universe began was that, you know, no one really has a good answer or explanation for how that started either. No one has a great answer for how the universe got here. Not just in the sense that we haven't proved scientifically which answer is the correct one, but in a much scarier sense that I don't think there's any theoretically possible, there's not even an answer that could explain it. It's not like and one might be right. It's like all the explanations for how the universe got here are fundamentally flawed in ways that I have no idea how it even could have possibly happened. So when I was trying to look at the origins of the universe, how we got here, it really doesn't make sense. I don't think anyone has ever given a good explanation for how we got here or how the universe began to exist. And yet, I can't make the same move that I made with the Trinity, where I say, well, the origins of the universe don't make sense. Therefore, I'm not going to believe in it because, well, I exist, right? The universe does exist. So even though it might not make sense, it still happened because, the universe exists. I might not be able to make sense of how it exists, but it does. So somehow or another, it must have been created. And the more I looked at that question, the more I realized that the underlying problem of the underlying reason why we couldn't make sense of the origins of the universe was the same problem that was occurring in the Trinity. They weren't two separate issues. They were actually the same philosophical conceptual issue reappearing in both contexts. It was the same reason we couldn't make sense of the origins of the universe was the same conceptual reason we couldn't make sense of the Trinity. And so I realized, well, if the Trinity makes as much or rather as little sense as the origins of the universe, then does it become as rational to believe in the Trinity as to believe in our own existence? And so that became this new line of thought where I thought, maybe I don't need to make sense of the Trinity. Maybe I just need to show that it doesn't make sense in precisely the same way that the universe existing doesn't make sense. And then it becomes as plausible to believe in as my own existence. And so this was kind of the move that inspired the book, Monotheism. And of course, the logical next question that you probably have is, well, what is this problem that's somehow apparent in both the Trinity and the origins of the universe? Like, how are they the same issue? I guess I can get into that if you have more questions, if you want me to, or you can talk about, you can follow up on what I just said.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get into it. Before we get into anything else, it might be helpful because we're going to be talking a lot about the characters in the book and the conversations they have, to talk a little bit about them. Because you have talked now about the Holy Trinity, so maybe let's talk about the Trinity at this pub, the lesser Trinity at this pub. So the bartender and these two characters who are having a conversation. So could you tell us a little bit about these characters and sort of the roles they're playing in the conversation they're having together?
Yes, of course. I kind of jumped to the harder stuff first, which was stupid.
No, we'll get there. No, it wasn't stupid. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, so basically, the conversation they're having at the pub is a really hard, abstract, philosophical, theoretical one. And in order to make that digestible to, normal humans, I set it in the context of three people arguing with each other over a pint on Christmas Eve at a pub one year. And the first character is Vlad. He's kind of the stereotypical Christian in the conversation. He believes the orthodox things you want him to believe, and he's also rigorously thought through. He's kind of like the ideal you might have. Maybe like a Thomas Aquinas or something like that. And he's respectable. He's an honorable figure. The next character who enters is Edie, and he is a bit more of a scoundrel. Some days he believes, some days he doesn't, and it really just depends on what he ate for breakfast that morning. And he has all these doubts and questions and skepticisms, and he sits down at the table and basically says, I don't believe anymore. He starts complaining and basically lists 13 doubts he has about the Christian faith. He says the Trinity doesn't make sense. He says free will doesn't make sense. The incarnation doesn't make sense. And he goes through and he lists all these things about Christian faith that just do not make sense. And then Vlad says, well, let's start talking about it. And they get into this debate back and forth about it. And Vlad spends the first half of the book basically exploring his answer to the Trinity. How can we still believe in the Trinity even though it doesn't make sense? And that's kind of the first half of the book. And that argument follows the line that I just explored with you a few minutes ago. By juxtaposing the origins of the universe and the Trinity, we find a way not so much to make sense of the Trinity, but rather to make sense of continuing to believe in it despite it not making sense. And that's the argument Vlad and Edie have. And halfway through, the bartender, Mira, gets involved. And she starts really pestering them with a lot of questions. And she starts adding some really interesting insights. And she says some things that you really wouldn't expect a normal citizen on the street or just that you ran into at the pub to ask. And so that sort of hints that there's something mysterious and deeper to her character. but I won't ruin that because that's part of the unfolding of the plot. And so she kind of gets involved. And around that point in the plot, they pivot from the Trinity to all of Edie's other objections. And what they find is that in order to answer all those other objections about, the incarnation, free will, whatever it is, there's 13 of the objections. So we can go through those individually later. But they find that once you have this renewed, rigorous, solid grasp of the Trinity that is provided in the first half of the book, all your doubts about the other things begin to be clarified as well, because the Trinity is the crux of the whole Christian worldview, which doesn't make sense. And so once the first half of the book has really clarified the Trinity, you realize that the Trinity is actually the solution to all these other questions as well. And so a truly Trinitarian faith is what, I don't want to say solves because that's too final, but what relieves all of the doubts about the other questions. It's the linchpin that figures everything else out. And we can get into that later, but I mean, that really is the claim of the book. I make the rather arrogant, absurdly arrogant, as the subtitle says, absurdly arrogant claim that the Trinity is what helped me to believe in free will again, which is true. When I was a teenager, I kind of got to the point where I was like, free will does not make sense. And it was only through the process of wrestling with these ideas and the Trinity and the origins of the universe that I actually came around to believing in free will. And so we can discuss that logic later on, but it attempts to basically pivot from the origins of the universe to a rational defense of the Trinity. And then once you have the Trinity in place, everything else suddenly becomes clear. Free will makes sense. The incarnation makes sense. All these other issues we have begin to make sense. And those issues are they're not just theoretical, they're very practical. It gets into, Christians and gender roles. It gets into Christians and postmodernity and diversity and all these other questions. And so the 13 questions aren't all quite as abstract as the Trinity and the origins of the universe and free will, but they do use the Trinity as their foundation to relieve all of these other tensions. And so that's the debate the three of them are having. And because I would have been bored if I tried to write it as a stale textbook, I wrote it as arguing in a pub. And there's a lot of banter, and they're joking back and forth, and they're pulling pranks on one another. And my goal was to make it a genuine narrative in the midst of it also being a genuine academic proposal, a new proposal, as far as I'm aware. Not to arrogantly assume I've said something genuinely new. I'm sure some theologian somewhere said it sometime, but it's certainly not a topic anyone else that I've seen is addressing in the way that I'm trying to address it. And I think to some extent, writing it as a narrative in a pub has meant that academic theologians didn't think it was meant for them. And then academic topics meant that popular audiences didn't think it was meant for them. But what I was actually trying to do was forge a new path for academic works, one that merged the popular and the academic, and argue that, hey, maybe we should be doing better writing, because if Christianity is truly the pursuit of a God who's not just truth itself, but beauty itself, maybe our work should be a bit more aesthetically beautiful and readable and accessible. And part of that comes from my Platonic background, because the most academic of all treatises go back to Plato's Academy, the one who founded the Academy. And Plato didn't write dull treatises. He wrote debates and discussions where Socrates went around and pestered people in the midst of making love at their feasts. Like, these are very lived, embodied narratives. And so you could argue that the most historical academic treatises of all were the Socratic conversational dialogue over something such as a pint at a pub. And that's what I'm trying to redo here. Anyways, that got really long. You threw me that question and helped me make it more grounded and back to the characters, and then I got lost in like this broad discussion again and just negated what you were trying to alley-oop me there, and I just threw it away. But yeah.
Well, I didn't think you threw it away. Yeah, so let's just kind of get into some of the scenes. The book opens up on Christmas Eve night, as you said already. So, and you have the character Edie kind of confessing to Vlad, the buttoned up one you described. So Edie's kind of confessing his loss of faith, or at least his doubt about Christianity. So could you maybe share a little bit about what is the nature of Edie's doubt? What are some of kind of the main hangups that he's running into as he's trying to hold on to his Christian faith?
I would love to do that. I don't actually remember all 13, so I'm literally going to pull out the book and just list them off as I go through the book, which you can't see because this is an audio recording, but I've told you now. It's too late. So the first one's the Trinity, that it doesn't make sense. How's God three and one? The second one is the incarnation. How can God be this sort of transcendent, eternal, timeless, classical theist God, but also this incarnate Christ? The third is that religion negates the body, the physical world, matter, sex, and by extension, things like environmentalism and science. That it's so focused on heaven, it negates earth. It's so focused on the soul that it negates the body. The fourth objection is free will, that it doesn't make sense, that determinism or indeterminism are both incompatible with free will, and those are kind of the only options. So you're not free. And if you think you are, you're stupid. But that's not your fault because you didn't choose to be stupid. It's, yeah. The fifth one is the soul and the mind-body relation. How do we have a soul? And if we do, how does that relate to our brains? And why is so much of this mappable using neuroscience and leaving the soul completely out of the equation? So basically the mind-body relation problem. And whether in its modern scientific forms or going all the way back to the issues that come up with Descartes and how the body relate to each other. Then the next issue, number 7, is basically the problem of evil. How can God allow suffering and evil in the world? And particularly, how can Christians, especially religious evil caused by Christians, crusades, witch hunts, those types of things. The next question he addresses is the projection critique of Freud and Feuerbach, which is that, God's just a projection of our own humanity. Humanity has daddy issues, so we projected a daddy onto the clouds and saw what we wanted to see to fill that hole in our heart. The ninth one is, and this is a bit ridiculous that I'm just sort of listing these all off, but
you're good. You're good. I'm tracking.
The ninth one is kind of the opposite of the last. If the eighth critique was that God is a projection of humanity, the ninth is that, God is this transcendent, infinite other. How could our finite words ever really encompass or begin to describe God? Either God's a projection of us, or he's so transcendently beyond us that nothing we say about him really works because he's infinite, we're finite. And any attempt to encompass him in finite words breaks down. So theology and religion should just shut up because nobody actually has any clue who God is if he does exist. Number 10 is that there's no objective meaning or morality in the universe, that these aren't real things, and even if they were, we wouldn't be able to know what they are. So basically, sort of a nihilism, which is an objection I take very seriously. For me, it's either theism or nihilism. Both of those are plausible options for me, and I'm terrified of where I'm going to end up. So that's a huge question that I need to address, and I attempt to address it in this book. Then number 11, religious people always seem to be on the wrong side of every diversity battle ever, whether it's slavery or women's roles or repressing sexuality. And that's when, the Christmas theme kind of comes in, and he says, why can't we just let the Yuletide be gay? Singing the famous song as kind of a joke. And so that's sort of addressing, like, why are Christians taking these hardline stances on pretty much all of these issues, whether at present or throughout history? Like, why do religious people always seem to be on the wrong side of history? Then there's the next question is that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, which was also objection problem 1, but why are they all men? And that's more of the gender question. Why is it the Father and the Son? Where's the mother figure in the Trinity? And so kind of addressing like, is heaven a sausage fest? And can we really believe that eternity is solely masculine? And does believing in the Trinity require you to believe that? And then finally, as kind of a question he just throws out there, because this character, Edie, you're not meant to like Edie. You're meant to, he's somewhere between Barney Stinson on How I Met Your Mother and some sort of sleazy priest. He's in between those two characters. And so he very casually, for a 13th objection, just because he wants to end on the number 13, he throws out, what's with all these priests molesting little boys? And that does come back around and is addressed later in the book. So now, as you can probably tell, that's a very eclectic range of issues. And they all seem disconnected, but the claim of the book is that once you solve the Trinity, all these other issues fall into line and suddenly make sense. It might seem very sprawling, like, oh, this is episodic. He addresses one issue after another in separate ways. But no, I think that these 13 problems actually are one problem. And once you solve the one problem of the Trinity, all the others make sense. So
got it. Okay. No, thank you for that. So let's kind of zoom in on the Trinity then, because in your second chapter, Vlad starts to make this kind of impassioned and nuanced defense of the Trinity. So how would you describe his argument for the truthfulness, I guess both the truthfulness and the reality, I guess, of the Trinity?
Yes. I mean, I've been long-winded this whole time, but this is going to be especially long-winded. So yeah, the argument that he makes is that, yeah, the Trinity doesn't make sense. But hey, the origins of the universe also doesn't make sense. And when you look at them long enough, you begin to realize, hey, they both don't make sense, and for precisely the same reasons. It's not two separate issues in two separate areas. It's actually one conceptual philosophical issue that's manifesting in two different contexts, one in theology, one in cosmology, but it's the same problem in both. So the question becomes, okay, well, what is this problem that is the same in both? And that's what I'll get into right now. When we're talking about the origins of the universe, I think we're attempting to explain, how did this world of time and space come into existence? The realm of what many have described as becoming, this world of becoming, where empires rise and fall, where time flows, where things begin and end, where kings rise and fall, where babies are born and swiftly die of old age. This realm where things are constantly becoming other things and changing. And so this is the realm of becoming that we exist in down here, right? We're in time. And we feel the passage of time and becoming every second. We're feeling it right now. And so that's what we're trying to explain. How did we get here in this moment in time? How did the universe come to exist? How did the realm of becoming become? And I think there's three answers to that, broadly speaking. First one is that becoming explains becoming in an infinite regression of becoming. How did I get here? Well, that's thanks to David and Bunny Lion. Yes, my mother's name is Bunny Lion. Ha ha. I'm trying to make fun of her in all my podcasts because I know she listens, and I get a kick out of her sitting at home going, Jonathan, stop it. Anyway, so where did I come from? How did I get here? Well, my mom and my dad. Well, where did they come from? From their parents. Well, where did their parents come from? Their parents. Well, where did they come from? Their parents. And it keeps going back to the origins of the species. Then it goes back to the origins of the planet, the origins of the elements, the origins of the stars, the origins of the universe itself. You keep pushing the question back. Okay, what caused this? Well, this caused that. Well, what caused that? Okay, but what caused that? But what caused that? But what caused that? Like an annoying child who keeps asking, but why, but why, but why? And eventually you get to the origins of the universe itself. And then you might say something like, well, the Big Bang caused it. Well, what caused the Big Bang? Well, maybe there was another universe that existed before ours, and it collapsed in on itself, then led to a bounce effect that led to another Big Bang. Okay, so there's another universe before ours. What was before? Well, there's another universe before that had its own Big Bang that caused it, And it keeps going back with one thing causing another thing, causing another thing in an infinite regression of causes with becoming, explaining, becoming, explaining, becoming. That's the first option. How did the universe get here? The universe of becoming is explained by option one, becoming. An infinite chain of becoming where becoming explains itself forever in an infinite chain. Now, the problem with this is that I think infinity just doesn't make sense. If an infinite period of time has to elapse before we got to this moment in time, would we ever get to this moment in time? If I said that I would come on your podcast after an infinite period of time had elapsed, would I ever come on your podcast, Zechariah?
No.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, no, I wouldn't, because an infinite period of time would have to elapse first. And so if an infinite chain of past becoming had to occur before we got to this moment, we never would have got to this moment, because infinity can never be crossed. Infinity doesn't just mean a very large number like 20 trillion, billion, fafillion, Brazilian. No, that's just a very large finite number. Infinity is that which can never be crossed, no matter how finite addition or time you wait. And so we would never get to this moment in time if an infinite past chain of becoming had to occur first. And there's also other problems with infinity. It's internally contradictory, or at least inconsistent. Say that you had two cars, one going 40 miles per hour and another going 20 miles per hour, and they were both going for an infinite period of time. Now, how many circles around the block would they have made if they were circling around the block for an infinite period of time? Well, the answer to both has to be infinite. The car has been going around the block for an infinite period, so it must have gone around the block an infinite amount. But one of the cars is going twice as fast as the other car. So how is it that both cars have gone around the block an infinite number of times, and yet one has gone twice as many times around the block as the other? And so you end up having to say that half of infinity is equal to all of infinity. That something going twice as fast as something else for an infinite period of time will end up going around the block the same amount of times, an infinite amount of times. And so you end up having to say things like, well, maybe there's greater or lesser infinites. And I don't want to get into that because that's going to get into too much of the mathematics of things. But I personally think that infinity does not make sense. And I think it breaks down. It transcends finite understanding. And so I that the first option for how the universe got here does not make sense. That if you try to appeal to becoming to explain our universe becoming, then you have to say, well, what caused this thing in becoming? Well, another thing in becoming. Oh, well, what caused that? Well, another thing in becoming. And it ends up in an infinite causal regress of becoming. So becoming cannot explain itself in an infinite chain. That doesn't make sense. So the first option for how the universe got here, becoming, doesn't work. Because then if becoming explains the universe, then what caused the becoming that explained the universe? Oh, and then what caused that? So I would say the first option, becoming, doesn't work. But this is where many have, and I'm sure you're going there in your head with the cosmological argument, many have then said, well, what we need is not something that's in time or part of becoming. What we need is something that is outside of time, something that isn't becoming, but is rather sheer being. That which has always existed, never began to exist, and so doesn't need to be brought into existence, but rather is eternal. Something that is timeless, and so does not need to begin in time, for it never began. It just is. And so becoming is in time, right? Becoming is a thing. And so trying to explain the existence of time by appealing to something else in time always ends in an infinite regress. What we need to stop the regress and ground creation in something is something that doesn't regress back in time, but is timeless, something that has always been, and so doesn't need to be brought into existence because it simply is. It's eternal. It's outside of time. And this is, of course, where many have said, that timeless thing is God. We can't have an infinite regress. That doesn't make sense. We can't keep going back and back in time with one thing in time explained in time. We need to hit rock bottom. We need to appeal to the timeless, to something that is not becoming, but is sheer being. And so that's the second option. The first option is becoming, an infinite chain of causal becoming. The second option is being. What created the universe? A timeless, eternal, transcendent being. And that is the end of the question. That's the cosmological argument right there, right? What grounds all of time and prevents it infinitely regressing? A timeless entity that doesn't need to be explained because it's outside of time. The problem I have with that I think makes the second option not make sense, is that how can a timeless entity begin to create the universe in time? Because then you're bringing time words back into it and subtly reintroducing the infinite regression. In order to avoid God needing a cause of God's existence, you took God outside of time. Okay. But in so doing, you made God impotent to begin to cause anything at all. Because a timeless entity is not, a timeless entity is just sort of frozen in place. It's not doing stuff because it's outside of time. Doing stuff, beginning to do things, cause and effect, those are temporal terms. Now, so you can't have a timeless being begin to create the universe. You've avoided the infinite regress problem, but also negated God's ability to create the universe at all. And some have tried to get around this by saying, what if God eternally, timelessly, forever and always creates the universe? What if that's an eternal act? Okay, but if God is timelessly, eternally creating the universe, then the universe would also be timeless and eternal. If the cause is eternally in effect, the effect is eternally caused, right? If the cause is eternal, so is the effect. You can't have one without the other. And so there's this attempt to try to explain how a timeless can, at the moment of creation, overlap with time. And I think that doesn't work. I think people have been trying to get around that for thousands of years, and I think it just does not make sense. And so I would say both of those options, becoming and being, to explain the existence of the universe, do not work. They do not make sense. But then there's a third option, and I call this the both option because I used to be a preacher and I like to alliterate with the B's. First, becoming, that doesn't make sense. Second option is being, that doesn't make sense. Third option is both. It is a eternal, timeless being that is somehow one with becoming. An entity that is being and becoming at the same time. An entity that isn't one or the other, but both of those together. And as such, because it's timeless being, there doesn't need to be an infinite regress. All things are grounded in it. And yet, because this entity is also becoming, it can begin to create the universe in time. Such a being could explain the existence of our universe. But of course, the problem is that it also does not make sense. For if an entity is being, timeless being, and is temporal becoming, then that's a contradiction. It's both timeless being and temporal becoming at the same time and in the same way. And so the third option would account for the universe existing, but it also does not make sense. Now, this is where the absurdly arrogant part comes in, but I really do think that I have never heard a creation story that doesn't fall into one of those three categories. I mean, we might have different narratives about the universe being sung into being, or emerging out of chaos, or being created by the gods. There's obviously thousands of different and unique and nuanced creation accounts, but I'm not sure if there's any one of them that couldn't fit into one of these three categories, because what I've just outlined is pretty exhaustive. Either the universe is explained by something that is outside of time, inside of time, or both. Reworded, either the universe is explained by something that is temporal, atemporal, or both. Either A, non-A, or both. Those are logically pretty exhaustive categories, right? And so none of those options make sense for how the universe got here. And yet, it did somehow. right? The
Mm-hmm.
universe exists. We're here having this conversation in time and space in a universe that at least seems like it exists. And so, even though none of the three options make sense, one of them, somehow or another, must have occurred, or else we wouldn't exist here to talk about it. And so, it becomes as plausible to believe in one of those three options as it is to believe in your own existence. You might not be able to make sense of it, but you have to be like, it makes as much sense as your own existence. So, it becomes plausible. I liken this to one of these committees I serve on at my university, the entry committee who gets into the university with student applications. It's sort of like, okay, we've gone through all the 4.0 students. They all got in. The 3.9, 7, 6, 5, we've let all of those in. Now we're down to the 2.6 GPA students, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our university has a quota. One of those, we have a certain number of spots that have to be filled in order to pay the bills. We have one spot left and only 3 applications. Okay, well, let's look at all applications GPAs, and whoever has the best GPA gets in. Oh crap, they all have 2.6s. Okay, therefore, in this situation, the GPA cannot be the determining factor for which student gets accepted. In the same way that making sense cannot be the determining factor for which account of our universe existing you go with, because all of them equally suck in that regard. All of the explanations for how the universe got here suck. And so you cannot decide which one is correct on the basis of which one makes sense, because none of them make sense. And none of those students have a better GPA than any other. They all have 2.6. So if you're going to decide which student gets in, you're going to have to decide on some other factor other than GPA, such as extracurricular activities, sizable donations, attractiveness, that sort of thing. So with all of that said, if one of those 3 options for how the universe began to exist must have occurred, despite it not making sense, well, let's see which ones we might play around with. I mean, explaining, becoming in an infinite regression on its own kind of sounds like atheism. Or it's consistent with a universe where, it's just matter infinitely regressing into the past. Being sounds kind of compatible with some sort of more philosophical views, but the both option is the one I really want to explore. One of these 3 options must have occurred and we can accept and believe in despite it not making sense, because it makes as much sense as our own existence. And let's look at the both option. The both option doesn't make sense, but we can still believe in it in the same way. It's as rational to believe in as our own existence, even though it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because it's a contradiction, right? An entity that is both eternal, timeless being and temporal, in time becoming. How can an entity be fully both of those things? Well, it can't. That would be a contradiction. And what a contradiction would entail is it's not a mixture of parts. If I say I'm 50% of the time and I'm out of my office 50% of the time, that's not a contradiction. Well, how could you say you're in your office but also out of your office? Well, that's not a contradiction, because I'm in the office for part of the time and I'm out of the office for part of the time, right? A mixture of pieces isn't a contradiction. It can't be 50% being, 50% becoming, because that's just a mixture. And the question of how they overlap, how being gives birth to becoming, isn't answered there. It's that they'd have to be a true contradiction, and to actually explain how the universe began to exist, it would have to be 100% being, 100% becoming, and 100% both. 3 in 1, 1 in 3. And so the both option entails that there's this thing, entity, object, whatever it is, that is timeless, eternal, transcendent, be outside of time, and yet it is also able to begin to create the universe in time. It is 100% being and 100% becoming, and yet somehow also 100% both. 3 in 1, 1 in 3. This eternal, timeless being is outside of time, and yet it is also in time. Through its becoming, it can make itself known. Though no one has ever seen eternal, transcendent, timeless being, through becoming, we can know him. And if this is truly a contradiction, where it's being and becoming, it could be said that in the beginning, becoming was and becoming was being. Through becoming, all things were made. Without becoming, nothing was made that has been made. For how could being begin to create in time unless it already had becoming within it in order to begin to be able to do things? Because in order to begin to do things or to create, you already have to have time and becoming within you, which is precisely what being, timeless being on its own, does not have. Being can only create through becoming, through the bothness of both of them together. And so, in that sense, only through becoming can all things be made. And yet, becoming is one with being in this both option. Becoming is separate from being, but it also is one with being. And so, you can obviously see what I'm doing here. I'm beginning to equate the cosmological categories of being, becoming, and both to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
The Father is this timeless, eternal, transcendent entity that is so transcendent that you can't even see his old face in the Old Testament without dying. And yet, then shows up this finite temporal human of flesh in the incarnation, Emmanuel, God with us, God in time. And the question Jews rightfully had is, how the hell does that work? How is this temporal dude who I can reach out and we can crucify and Thomas can stick his hand in the nail holes? How can that temporal incarnate dude be one with eternal, timeless, transcendent being? And so you realize the relationship of how being and becoming connect is actually at the heart of how can the Father be one with the Son, such that, I don't know how eternal, timeless being can become one and overlap with temporal becoming, but somehow or other it did, or else we wouldn't exist to talk about it. And I don't know how this eternal, timeless, transcendent Father, the classical God figure that we talk about, is one with this temporal, incarnate, feeling, suffering Christ. But it makes as much sense as our own existence. And so I might not be able to make sense of it, but I can make sense of believing in it nonetheless, because it's as rational as believing that we're here having this discussion right now. And to some extent, this seems like, he's just imposing a rational philosophical system upon the text and filtering it through being, becoming, and both. But I mean, this connection should have been obvious to Christians all along, because we've always believed that the Trinitarian God created the universe. These were never two discussions. We've always believed that all three members of the Trinity must be involved in the creation of the universe because the Trinitarian God created it. The origins of the universe and the Trinity are not two separate discussions for Christians. They have always and forever been the same discussion, because the creation was a Trinitarian act, and it's only through the Trinity that anything comes to exist at all.
Okay. I'm just tracking here. We have the sort of the cosmological framework of becoming, being, and both, and that maps nicely onto Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We have this relationship between these three cosmological categories, or three cosmological sort of ways of making sense of time and space, and these have something to do with the roles of the three persons of the Trinity. So my next follow-up question, which I know is what your book sort of gets into and what you alluded to earlier, which is, how does this way of conceiving the Trinity start to answer some of those objections that Edie makes in the beginning of the book?
Yeah. Pull up my book again to find what the objections are. Also, I just took a bite of my brownie, but then I realized I didn't have any more orange juice. So now my mouth is full of brownie, but no liquid. So this is painful. Let me go back through it. So the first objection that follows right after the Trinity is the incarnation, right? How can Jesus be 100% God, but also 100% Middle Eastern man flesh, truly human and truly divine, in heaven and on earth, up there and down here. How can this eternal, timeless, transcendent God be one with this temporal Christ? And yet not just be one, but three, right? Like they're one, but also separate. And that was already explained previously. If the Trinity parallels those three things, so how do being and becoming relate? How does the timelessness of the Father relate to the temporality of the Son? Well, in whatever way the universe began to exist. I don't know how it makes sense. I don't know if I've ever heard a single theologian say a single coherent thing about it, but I think it makes as much sense to believe in as our own existence.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first objection. The third objection is about the body and rejecting earth for heaven, the body for eternity, the body for the spirit. And I mean, those are all, it's all coming down to rejecting time, rejecting the physical, the temporal for the timeless and eternal, and saying that those things are somehow more foundational. And I think when you come to embrace an idea where the becoming of Christ and the timelessness of the Father are both divine and that they are somehow unified in the triune relationship. It's not like timelessness is more God or more God, more divine than the becoming of the Son. I think that's when you begin to accept that our realm of becoming is also made in the image of God. It is a reflection of something deeply, eternally ontological, grounded in the deepest nature of what is. It's not a secondary invention. Now, this is not pantheism, because I'm not saying the universe of time is I'm not saying the universe of becoming is God. Rather, I'm saying becoming is divine, and through his becoming, he creates out of nothing a separate universe. And so he's sort of the hand of becoming that kickstarts the dominoes. The dominoes are kickstarted by a hand, but the dominoes aren't the hand. Anyways, because our becoming is made in the image of divine becoming, it's not less valid. And I think that's an incarnational view a lot of Christians have been trying to get back to already, even without this framework, that Christians aren't to reject earth for heaven, the body for the soul. Rather, we're meant to manifest the kingdom here and now on earth. That, Jesus's prayer is not, God, help us to ascend to heaven. Rather, it's your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's about the new Jerusalem, the new Israel, the new earth. It's about heaven coming to earth and time and eternity finally kissing and overlapping with this perfect overlapping of the ideal and the real. And I see all those things as reflections of what is already true in the Trinity. I think the Trinity is timeless becoming. It's being and becoming overlapping. And I mean, this is perfectly encompassed by the begottenness of the Son. He isn't caused at a particular moment in time. He wasn't. He's begotten, but it's not like he began to be begotten at some point in the past. He's eternally, timelessly begotten. He's timelessly temporal. He's eternally temporal. He's being and becoming wedded as one. And so we can say that the Son is temporal, begotten, becoming, and yet that doesn't make him any less eternal or any more created, because he is one with the timeless Father. And so he is eternally begotten, eternally becoming. He is being and becoming. He is becoming, but becoming and being in the third option of both are 100% contradictorily one. And so that might not make sense, but it makes as much sense as our own existence. These things Christians have been saying that have never made sense to anyone, well, as soon as you try to explain how anything got here, you end up saying very similar things. Mm-hmm. So anyways, that's the third objection. The fourth was free will. And before I get to that, can I say one thing, a caveat? Mm-hmm. I know I'm really rambling here, and
no, you're good.
But I'm excited to talk about these things, and I'm pissed that more people aren't talking about them, because the book's been out for a few years, and I'm like, come on. That's just the arrogantly absurd part, which I put in the title. I was open about that. I keep saying the contradiction of the Trinity and the contradiction of the universe. And I think a lot of Christians are going to be uncomfortable with that. And if you want to substitute paradox, you can, because my theory doesn't require you to believe in contradictions. Rather, it requires that you not reject the Trinity for currently seeming like a contradiction. I'm not saying the Trinity is a contradiction. And when I get to heaven, God will explain it to me and I'll go, wow, I'm an idiot. That makes so much sense. Why didn't I think of that? Totally possible. That's probably what will happen. I'm not saying the Trinity is a contradiction. Rather, I'm saying you shouldn't disbelieve in it just because it currently seems to your finite mind like a contradiction. Because, well, when you look at the universe itself, it also currently seems like a contradiction, and in the same exact way as the Trinity. So you shouldn't dismiss the one for seeming like a contradiction when you don't dismiss the other for doing that either. So this is not about what the Trinity is. And if you want to say it's a paradox, I think that's totally consistent with what I'm saying. Something that currently seems like a contradiction, but may or may not ultimately be. So none of what I'm saying requires you to jettison logic. It just requires you to admit that we currently can't make sense of something, and that perhaps it will ultimately make sense. It just doesn't seem to currently. And even though it doesn't seem to currently, shouldn't reject belief in it. I mean, it's very similar to the overlap between quantum mechanics and relativity. We don't currently know how to make sense of those two theories together. They seem like a contradiction, right? But that doesn't mean we embrace contradictions. It just means we say, well, I don't know how they both work, but somehow they both do. And we'll have to bracket off this area of knowledge and accept that at least currently we can't make sense of it. Right? But that doesn't mean you stop believing in relativity or in quantum physics. It just means you admit you don't know how they work together and you try harder, right? And we bracket off areas of knowledge that we can't make sense of all the time. One of the major rejections to my idea I've heard is that once you allow one contradiction, the principle of explosion kicks in and all other contradictions become permissible. And that I just don't think that applies, because we live with things that seem like contradictions, and that doesn't mean they are contradictions, but it does mean we have to find ways to deal with what seems like a contradiction. And that's what I'm trying to say here. Not that the Trinity must be a contradiction, but rather that you shouldn't dismiss it for currently seeming like one, because no one has a better explanation. You're either going to have to appeal to being, becoming, or both. Whether you're an atheist, you also have to answer how the universe got here. And you're going to end up going into the same semantic circles that Christians have been going in with the Trinity for thousands of years. No one is better than us when it comes to this. Islamic scholars constantly try to point out that the Trinity doesn't make sense. And I'm like, okay, provide me a coherent account of how the universe came to exist that avoids all of the issues I'm coming to when I talk about the Trinity, and then I'll believe that I'm stupid. But you can't. You're going to end up doing the same dancing and semantic moves that we're doing, just with the origins of the universe. Anyways, I just wanted to make that clear before I get into the next thing. Yeah, so the next one is free will. And basically, on the one hand, I have never heard anyone, philosopher, theologian, anyone, give a good explanation for how free will makes sense. And if you feel that same way, don't, as someone who has studied this quite a lot, don't think that this just doesn't make sense to you, but someone else out there understands it. No one understands it. Doesn't go to the top schools in the world. The top philosophers in the world are given the stupidest answers to this question ever, and it'll drive you crazy, like it drove me crazy. Nobody knows how to make sense of free will. And to overly drastically simplify it, it comes down to this issue. On the one hand, if our choices are made from within our nature, then they're sort of determined by our nature. Well, what caused me to do this? Well, you chose to out and push people away in your love life because of your Oedipal complex with, or something like that. Something within you caused you to act this way. What caused you to make this decision? Well, this caused me to make that decision. Well, what caused that? Well, this caused that. And it infinitely regresses to a time before you even existed. So if your choices are caused by something within your nature, then they're not really your choices. because who you are is the composite product of everything that came before you. One thing caused another thing, right? And so there's this kind of infinite chain of past causes, and you are the summation of those causes, and what you choose is just the result of those causes coming together, right? This is basically determinism. Everything is determined based on what has gone before it. So if everything is determined or caused, then what my is the product of everything that went before me. And so any choices that are consistent with my nature are just determined by everything that, right? So I might feel like I'm making choices, but a computer might be able to map out the 10 trillion reasons and causes that have come together to create who I am in this moment and the precise nature that I'm acting out of within myself. And that's what caused the action, right? Now, some people have thought, oh, okay, so in order to get around that, we need to show that some actions aren't caused, aren't determined by your nature. We need to show that some things happen outside of your nature. And so nothing within you caused it, rather, it just happened uncaused. And that's freedom. Well, that doesn't get around the problem either. That's called indeterminism. Because if my choices aren't caused by my nature, then they just pop into existence out of nothing. If they're not caused, then they occur without cause. They're more like the random jerkings of an arm than a rational choice that comes from who I am weighing the decisions, because nothing in me caused it. It came from chaos or whatever it is. If it's caused and determined by my nature. But if it's uncaused, it's occurred outside of my nature. So in what sense can we say that I chose it if I'm not the cause of it? So that's the conundrum. On the one hand, our choices have to be caused by our nature. On the other hand, they have to be caused by our nature in order for them to be our choices, right? And to come from and be ours. On the other hand, they can't be caused by our nature. They have to be outside of our nature, or else they're determined by our nature and all of these past causes, right? So the enigma of free will is you need to act both within and outside your nature at the same time, which is the definition of a contradiction, right? You need to act consistently with your nature and inconsistently with your nature at the same time. You need to act within your nature and who you are in order for it to be your choice instead of just a random emergence out of nothing. But you also need to act outside of your nature, or else your choices are just predetermined by the past regression of causes that created you to be who you are. So that's the trouble with that. I don't think anyone can make sense of free will. However, I think that enigma actually maps on quite marvelously to the Trinity creating the universe. You would have this timeless entity that is eternally what it is. And because it is timeless, it is unable to begin to act outside of its timeless nature to begin to create in time. However, because in its seemingly paradoxical oneness with becoming, this eternal timeless being can act outside of its nature to begin to create in time. And so the paradox of being, becoming, and both that is in the Trinity is the free act of creation. Creation isn't timelessly embedded in the nature of God. It is an act outside of his nature through beginning to create in time. God is timeless, so in order to begin to create, he's going to act outside of his timeless nature. However, because becoming is also one with being, it's also paradoxically one with his nature. In creating the universe, God acted both within and outside of his timeless nature to begin to create the universe. And so you can then say that free will makes as much sense as our own existence. And only if you choose the both option from those three options, being, becoming, or both, can you embrace that free will makes as much sense as our own existence. Because free will wouldn't work if it was paired just with the becoming option. It wouldn't work if it's just with the being option. It's the coming together of being and becoming in the both option, where you have the paradoxical union of a timeless nature and acting outside of that timeless nature to begin to create. And so only the both option is consistent with free will. And so I would argue that if you want a justification to believe in free will, I think the only way you can find it, despite it not making sense, because it doesn't make sense, the only way you can continue to believe in it not making sense is by paralleling it to the origins of the universe and saying, well, that doesn't make sense either. But in so doing, by drawing that parallel, you admit that the origins of the universe were a free will choice, meaning that theism is implicit in belief in free will. And so if you merge the act that created the universe with human free will, you then make the origins of the universe a free act. And so things have been done here. I've created an argument that says, yes, free will doesn't make sense, but it makes as much sense as our own existence. Therefore, you can continue believing in it. That's an argument that uses the Christian Trinity to justify continuing to believe in free will despite not making sense of it. Because I don't believe anyone's made sense of it, but I think it makes as much sense as our own existence. So if you believe you exist, you can believe in free will. But the second move I've then made is I've moved back from free will, origins of the universe, to say, if you believe in free will, then the way you've done that is through paralleling it to the origins of the universe. So you should also be a theist. So this might be something along the lines of the free will argument for the existence of God. And specifically, the free will argument for the existence of the triune Trinitarian Christian God. Because if you're talking about the both option, you're talking about an entity that is 100% being, 100% becoming, and 100% both. You're talking about a Trinitarian 3-in-1 type of thing that shockingly parallels the Trinity in a myriad of ways. So that's the parallel to free will. And that's how I've kind of managed to continue believing in free will. Well, continuing to believe it makes zero sense. And being deeply annoyed at any theologians or philosophers who pretend otherwise, because it doesn't make sense. People are the lengths that people will go to pretend they've made sense of free will make me want to just, I don't know, freely do an act that I can claim I'm not culpable for because free will doesn't exist. Anyways, I can continue on to parallel it to the other things, but if you want to pause for a second to respond to that, we can. Whatever you want to do.
Sure. I think all this is really great stuff. So if you want to pick maybe one more of the objections and kind of this Trinitarian response to it to go over, and then we could wrap up, that'd be perfect. I think it'd be interesting. Some of those last objections. The one about how the church is always on the wrong side of history. I think that could be an interesting one if you wanted to address that for a few minutes.
Yeah, so I think, the heart of that was diversity. And why is the church constantly taking the wrong stance, seemingly wrong stance on every question of diversity ever, whether it's women or sexual issues, these types of questions. And I don't address each specific issue because that's getting specific. What I argue rather is that I think, and this is another absurdly arrogant claim, that I need the Trinity to make sense of embracing diversity to begin with. And what I mean there is all of us, whether we admit it or not, we all have an ontology, a metaphysic. And if at the heart of your metaphysic and your ontology is absolute oneness, then diversity, difference, otherness is a perversion of the initial oneness. Because presumably in your ontology, that which is one is also our foundations for morality, for goodness, right? And so you would then have to say that diversity and difference and otherness are later creations, inventions, things that are not eternally good or internally part of the nature of existence itself, but are, you could almost say, perversions of that which is eternally, timelessly good. And so diversity, difference, otherness, these are things that are ultimately shed on the Enlightenment journey back to oneness, right? There's not two-ness, there's not difference, there's not, hey, I'm different from you, and that's okay. No, because oneness is the ultimate value of the universe. Unity trumps difference, diversity, and otherness. And I think something like that is, I've seen a lot of that come out that have sort of uncritically adopted Advaita Vedanta without engaging with the wider panoply of Eastern thought. I think, on the other hand, though, even your own, so that's the problem with embracing absolute oneness at the heart of your ontology. But on the other hand, embracing absolute oneness negates diversity, and so you're not going to embrace women or other whether it comes to race or these other things. But on the other hand, if at the heart of your ontology and metaphysic and universe and value system is not oneness, but manyness, then I think you end up with I don't want to say postmodern, because that's such a cliche, overused, almost meaningless word these days, but and with the caricatured image of what postmodernity is, which is absolute difference with no underlying thread of unity. There is no underlying morality that is true for everyone everywhere. All we have are different perspectives on things, and no one is a privileged underlying unifying thread. There's just difference. The serial killer is just different from me. He's just other from me. But there's not some higher unity that binds all people in worldviews and demands that they adhere to one system or moral value or underlying ethic. All you have is ever-changing difference, otherness, Heraclitan change and shifting. There's no oneness or unity underlying the chaos, and anyone who claims there is selling something. Religious people, moral people, are pretending that they've found the one true thing, and there is no such thing. There's just different views on everything, and there's nothing that underlies them or unifies everyone at the end of the day. And what I think about that is that, that's kind of where our society's been heading to some extent, with, not wanting to judge anyone else's system, and there not being some sort of underlying form or unity that everyone should have to fit into. And I think at the end of the day, that's arguably nihilism, because there is no form. There's no one form. Diverse, different worldviews all have to ultimately surrender to. Everyone's just different. There's no way to judge them. There's no one system. And so, that's, on one hand, that seems to embrace diversity, right? Yeah, diversity, it's the heart of our universe. But even to say that you should tolerate diversity on that system, you can't say that anymore, because that's imposing an overarching framework of tolerance upon other people. But that's precisely what you can't do on that system, because the intolerant person isn't wrong. They're just different. They're just a diverse new perspective. You can't appeal to an underlying idea that critiques someone who is unokay with difference. So absolute difference at the heart of your ontology and metaphysic doesn't lead to diversity. It negates diversity in a kind of an ironic reversal of absolute oneness. So what you need at the heart of your universe in order to ethically say that diversity is good is something that isn't just one or isn't just many, but is both one and many. You need the Trinity, or something shockingly like it. You need an underlying unity such that you can say everyone should be respectful of diversity, difference, and otherness. But you also need otherness itself to be part of that underlying ontology, such that you can say, yes, otherness is inherently good, because the underlying is one with the other. The Trinity is not just an eternal self. It's an eternal self and other in a dance, such that the dance of self and otherness between me and my partner, me and other people in the world, me and other demographics, me and other cultural movements and races, that dance between self and other is the image of the Trinity and embedded within the ontological foundations and ethical foundations of reality itself. And so you need oneness in order to an underlying way that everyone should fit into. Everyone should fit into one morality of love and acceptance for the other. You need oneness, but you also need manyness. You need the one, but you need the three. And that's the beauty of the Trinity. They're three and they're one. And as soon as you try to say the oneness is more fundamental than the threeness, you negate otherness, diversity, and difference in your worldview. But as soon as you try to say the threeness is more fundamental than the oneness, the same problem occurs in the reverse. And so it's the tensions that I think our culture is trying to navigate right now about ethics. They're the same tensions Christians have been dealing with at the heart of the Trinity for thousands of years. And there's no way to make sense of them. But in paralleling them to the Trinity, you get an understanding of why they don't make sense. Because you're trying to make sense of not just some random ethical issue, you're trying to make sense of the mystery at the heart of all of existence, from which all things were birthed. And I can't make sense of that, but I can accept that it makes as much sense as our own existence, and that the Trinity gives me a really cool framework for addressing questions of diversity, difference, and how we move forward in society and navigate these moral questions. Now, that doesn't give you a great answer to specific questions of why have Christians always taken questionable stances towards diversity questions, but it does show you that the way forward isn't to reject a Christian metaphysics, but to return to it and be better at maintaining that metaphysic and less douchey in negating otherness, because our God is self and other. We have the archetype for how to solve these questions, and not solve them in a sense of making sense of them, but rather making sense of why we can't make sense and figuring out a way to move forward in light of that and to foster that mystery and not try to reduce it one way or the other, not trying to reduce it to absolute diversity and difference, or on the other end to absolute oneness, to hold the Trinitarian tension moving forward in our ethical conversations.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so as we kind of land the plane here, is there anything that you'd like to plug? Obviously, we're promoting this book of yours, Monotheism, and also, we've discussed your book, Space God, in a prior episode. So we'll leave links to both of those in our show notes. But do you have anything kind of coming down the line, and anything you'd like the chance to maybe briefly talk about here?
Yeah, well, if anyone wants more information about what I'm doing, they can go to jdlyonhart.com. That's JDLYONHART, jdlyonhart.com. I post everything there. Something I'm really excited about is the podcast, the Spiritually Incorrect Podcast, which you can find that at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com. I think I already mentioned that, but we've said so much that I've forgotten literally everything that's gone before. But yeah, I have so much fun doing that. It's just me and Seth. Seth's my brother-in-law, and our banter back and forth gets vicious, but we're also just having so much fun, and we're bringing in theology, and both of us have done ministry stuff, so we're making it practical, but also theoretical, and we're interviewing whatever crazy person we can find, whether it's a Satanist or telepathy or whatever it is. So yeah, the upcoming episode on that is the strange views of C.S. Lewis. We got a guy who did his doctorate on C.S. Lewis at Oxford, and he's talking to us about how C.S. Lewis actually doesn't really fit into evangelical theology very well at all. And here's all of his crazy views that people kind of ignore, and navigating that, whether it's purgatory or his views on scripture or it's a wild, fun episode. So.
Awesome. That sounds very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.